This is Michael Cox of Worldify. The purpose of this course is to give you a broad foundational understanding of offshoring, and to do it in a short amount of time. I've been helping companies offshore tasks and working with offshore resources for over 20 years now. I've also researched the topic extensively, reading materials quoted by those who were for offshoring, and also materials quoted by those who are against it. And so this course combines decades of experience with hundreds of hours of research and summarizes it for you in a concise, easy-to-understand format. The course is divided into 8 short modules. This first module introduces the topic and is free. For a very small fee, you can access the other 7 modules immediately, and instructions for that can be found on worldify.com. Now let's take a look at the contents of the course. First, we'll look at some definitions, terms, and concepts that relate to offshoring. Then we'll take a look at a few examples of offshoring and talk about how it benefits different groups of people in different ways. We'll look at some facts and some trends, and we'll discuss the political sensitivity of this topic, which is a highly politically sensitive topic, which includes the subtopic of protectionism. We'll talk about when protecting might be a good thing, and how we need to do more to help those who are displaced by offshoring. Then we'll sum it all up, talk about some things you might consider and things you might do next. Then I'll show you all the resources that I use to compile this information. Let's start by looking at a few terms. All of these definitions come from Wikipedia. Offshoring is the movement of a business process done at a company in one country to the same or another company in another country. It's simply taking work from one country and giving it to another. Outsourcing is the movement of internal business processes to an external company. So it's taking work done internally and giving it to a different company. Companies subcontracting in the same country would be outsourcing but not offshoring. A company moving an internal business unit from one country to another would be offshoring but not outsourcing. And of course, a company subcontracting a business unit to a different company in another country would be both outsourcing and offshoring. And now just a couple of economics terms. A country has an absolute advantage over another country in producing a good if it can produce it using fewer resources. That's absolute advantage. Comparative advantage is the ability of a person or country to produce a particular good at a lower marginal cost and opportunity cost than another person or a country. More importantly, it's the ability to produce a product most efficiently given all the other products that could be produced. Basically, it means that you should trade in what you are least bad at making. Let's look at a practical example that illustrates these terms. This example also comes from Wikipedia. Suppose we have 2 countries of equal size, Northland and Southland. Assume that both of them produce 2 things, food and clothes, and that the capacities and efficiencies of these countries are such that if both countries devoted all of their resources to food, then the output would be Northland 100 tons and the Southland could do 200 tons. Now right here we see that the Southland has an obvious absolute advantage over the Northland. If they're able to produce twice as much food, then this means that they have some advantage in resources that enables them to be more efficient than the Northland in the production of food. That's an absolute advantage. However, if all the resources of the countries were allocated to the production of clothes, the output would be different. The Northland would still produce 100 tons of clothes in this case, but the Southland would only produce 100 tons in this case. In other words, it has no absolute advantage in the production of clothes like it did with food. Moreover, you might say that the Northland has a comparative advantage in the production of clothes. Even though it can't produce any more clothes than the Southland can, it is at less of a disadvantage in the production of clothes compared to food, where it can only produce half as much as the Southland. Now let's assume that the Northland and the Southland desire not to trade with each other. So they decide to devote half of their resources to the production of food and the other half to clothes. The Northland could produce 50 tons of food, which is half of their 100-ton capacity, and they could also produce 50 tons of clothes, which is half of their 100-ton capacity for clothes. The Southland could produce a 100 tons of food, which is half of their 200-ton capacity for food, and just like the Northland, 50 tons of clothes, which is half of their 100-ton capacity, for a world total of 250 tons of food and clothes. Now let's assume that the Northland and the Southland have decided that they would like to trade in order to maximize world output and benefit. The Northland has no absolute advantage for either food or clothes, but should stick to clothes because that is its comparative advantage. It's the thing that it's less bad at. The Southland has an absolute advantage in food, as we said before, because it can make more food than Northland, and food also happens to be its comparative advantage because it can make more food than it can clothes. So with this output, we see that the Northland produces 100 tons of clothes and the Southland produces 200 tons of food for a world total of 300 tons, which is 50 more tons than in the scenario where they didn't trade. And that is Economics 101 in a nutshell. At this point, you may be wondering what economics has to do with offshoring. Much of the debate surrounding offshoring relates to defining its real benefit or lack of. And benefit, it turns out, is a difficult thing to measure, especially world benefit. And in these cases, experts often use economic models that attempt to simplify the complex by removing unnecessary noise in order to make these things analyzable at all. The problem with models is they're often too simple to be useful, and they tend to remain static over time even as the world around us changes. Here's an example of what I mean. Comparative advantage says countries are better off sticking to what they do best compared to other countries. However, this concept and the model that produced it originated in a time when agricultural, mining, and some textile products dominated trade. In other words, trade was dominated by products that relied on natural resources, which are found more abundantly in some places than others. That gave some countries an advantage over others. However, many of today's industries are based on skills, knowledge, or technology, which flow a lot more easily from one country to the next. Information nowadays is the great equalizer, and as more of the world connects to the internet and other infrastructure, they gain access to the same information everyone else has. This means learning a new skill, gaining new knowledge, or mastering a new technology is just a few clicks away. As we saw in the model, 50 additional tons of food and clothes could be created if the Northland and the Southland traded with each other. However, that 50 additional tons was for the world, and for the reasons noted above, would not necessarily flow evenly to the Northland and the Southland today. As Gomery and Baumol point out in their book, Global Trade and Conflicting National Interests, most countries don't even know where they are with respect to promoting world benefit versus self-interest, nor have most consciously decided or declared which goal they are pursuing. It seems clear that pursuing self-interest is a must, while pursuing world interest is more of a goal, something countries want to be seen as pursuing, but not at the expense of self-interest when the two come into conflict. And finally, the notion of retainable industries, which are characterized by large startup costs that discourage competition from smaller startups, enables countries to hold on to these industries once they've won them, no matter how they've won them. I think the Japanese auto industry is a good example of this. In the next section, we'll look at some examples of offshoring and take a look at how it benefits countries, companies, and individuals.